right, in this Child Month, May's Child Month, the theme this year, affirm me, acknowledge me, friend me, favor me, influence me positively, respect me, and motivate me.
I don't want to be you. I don't want to be.
We're going to be joined on the phone lines now by my next very special guest, Rick Belden, poet, author, artist, and men's coach. Good morning, Rick. How are you?
Good morning. I'm very good. I'm very happy to be with you and to have some time with your listeners this morning.
All right. We're very happy to have you with us, too. We have been talking all morning about healing the mother wound. I want to get your perspective as to what the mother wound is. But since I just had a conversation with our sports editor, and he said to me bluntly that he has a problem with the term mother wound because it sounds as if something is wrong with mother. And I told him I'll talk to you about it to see if you'd at least change that, tongue in cheek. But have you heard this before? Is it something that you can relate to?
I haven't heard that one before. I do know that it means different things to different people, and that I have my own definition that I use, which I would like to share with you, and maybe that would clarify some things.
All right, please go ahead. How do we define the mother wound?
The way that I define it and the way I use it in my work with men is that a mother wound may be thought of as an injury to the psyche of a child resulting from significant dysfunction or disruption in the relationship with the mother. In some cases, it's the result of a mother's absence or unavailability due to death, illness, adoption, or other circumstances that dramatically separate the child from the mother. But more typically, a mother wound is a complex of injuries to the child's psyche received over many years, often as a result of the mother acting consciously or not out of her own woundedness. So there is an element of, in my definition, of the mother herself being wounded in some way that she's typically not aware of and that she typically unconsciously shares and propagates with the child.
Mm-hmm. I want you to break this down for me, Rick, please, so that our listeners can understand. You say it's defined as an injury to the psyche of a child, and that comes as a result from a significant disruption or dysfunction in relationship with the mother. Can you elaborate on that? Probably with examples.
Yes. So one example might be the case where the mother is, as a result of circumstances in her own childhood, perhaps, she did not receive the kind of loving nurturance and sense of security and self-affirmation that she needed to receive as a child. And so she goes into adulthood with a significant lack around her own ability to love herself and see herself as having worth. And that may result in a situation where when she has a child, she uses that child unconsciously to try to, as a way to define herself as a person who has value. And that, unfortunately, reduces the opportunity for the child to feel the very same value and the very same affirmation and the sense of its own definition as a separate person, as opposed to sort of a resource for the mother to feel better and understand who she is.
Mm-hmm. And I like that you've included in the definition that some of this might be as a result of the mother's absence or unavailability, and this could be to death, illness, adoption, or other circumstances. And one probably wouldn't think that this would be significant in how that the mother-son relationship would further impact the child as a man, for example. So I wanted to look at that for me a bit closer. Absence, separation issues, is this what we're talking about?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, and that can be literal physical absence and separation, but it can also manifest as emotional absence and separation. You know, I think there's a pretty good understanding of the impact on boys and men of having a father who's absent or unavailable, whether physically or emotionally. And I think there's fair amount of conversation about that and how it relates to how a boy matures and how a man grows up lacking some definition around himself. And I believe there's also a maternal aspect to that. If the mother is literally or physically or emotionally absent, there is something. Now, other women, of course, can fill in, and they can fill that role, but there's something very special about the fact that, as a human being, we actually begin our lives as part of another human being's body, and that's the first person that we are physically and emotionally and psychologically bonded with. And if that is interrupted or if that is taken away at some point, it can create a bit of a hole in a person. And for a man, that is the first woman, literally, that he is close with, that he's intimate with, that he falls in love with. And so if there's some sort of disruption in that, it can certainly ripple through the rest of his life and his interactions with women around him.
So that the mother wound can present in the male child and the son, even if the mother is absent.
Yes, I believe so, yes. And again, it goes back to that very primal, initial, physical connection that we all start our life with the woman, where we, literally begin in her body. She gives us birth. I think that there's an unconscious sort of bond there that's very strong that is going to remain throughout our whole life, whether she continues to be present or not. Mm-hmm. And if that bond is not actually, I guess, fulfilled, I would say, in some way through childhood, then it can leave a sense of something being missing or something not being finished or something not being received.
Mm-hmm. What about periodic absence, a mother who goes away for a while and comes back?
I would say that could present, I guess, or set a pattern of exactly what you said, that the maternal, the feminine, comes and goes, that it's not steady, that it's not reliable. And certainly I think that, among other things, that can generate a lingering sense of longing, a lingering sense of something being missing, and also some sense of resentment, as in, that kind of grows out of a feeling of rejection, because children don't understand why someone might come and go like that. They don't understand why someone just isn't there all the time. And the things that we don't understand as children, we often bury somewhere where they're not quite conscious, but they also often manifest in our interactions, in our decisions, and in our ways that we see ourselves in the world.
Well, let's just talk about this manifestation. So how does this manifest then now in the child who is injured?
Well, I believe, based on my work, that the way that it can manifest in boys as they grow up is that there's a feeling, perhaps, or a sense of things not being very reliable, of nurturance not being available. So you may find, if you've had that experience as a man, that as a child, that as you grow into a man, you may find it difficult to even pay attention to your own needs. You may find it difficult to know what your needs are if you have not had someone around who is paying attention to them and would actually take some action based on that. You may find that you don't even know what they are anymore, much less know how to express them to someone else, and so it can be very isolating.
One of the things that you have said also is that one of the most severe kinds of psychic wounding occurs when the child's primary function in the relationship is to be used by the mother to meet her own narcissistic needs. So this is the other end of the spectrum. Yes, and that's something I have had some experience with myself in my own childhood, and none of this is intended to be any kind of negative judgment toward anybody, but it's certainly, I know that it's been in my case true, and true in other cases that I'm aware of, that if the mother's sort of injury psychologically is so severe that she's essentially unable to see the child as a separate person, then that child, that boy, that man may never mature completely
because in order to mature completely, he has to be able to see himself as a separate person. And if you have a mother that is in that kind of state where she has those kinds of needs that are unconscious and somewhat even impossible perhaps for her to control, she's going to find it difficult to let go of you, and you're going to find it difficult to be able to assert yourself as an independent person because your role has been defined in such a way that you're there to meet her needs. And once again, that brings up the issue of, do you know what your own needs are? Are you able to articulate them? And that can be a real problem for an adult man in a relationship with a woman, because if you can't, whether you're male or female in a relationship, if you don't know your own needs and you can't articulate them, at some point the whole thing is going to go downhill, because you can't just be in a relationship where one person's needs are primary and the other person's needs almost don't exist.
And you speak of this being your own personal experience, and I wanted to examine that a little bit more. I think it is more common than many persons recognize. I think here on the ground in Jamaica, for example, it is seen as mama's boy, and in some cases it is celebrated. But you're saying that the down effect of that is how that son relates in his own relationship or engages with his own relationship with his wife, with another woman.
Yes, and even deeper, I guess, and more primary than that is the way that he engages in his relationship with himself. Mm-hmm. Because if a man can't be honest with himself about what he's feeling and what he needs and what he wants, then he can't do that with anybody else either. And so to the extent that, it manifests, I think, in a couple of different ways potentially. One is the nice guy that seems like he's just, always accommodating and ready to please. And, over time, he begins to feel resentful because he's not actually getting his needs met, because he's not saying what they are, because he doesn't know how, and it doesn't feel safe, and maybe he doesn't feel like he deserves that. And on the other hand, you might have a man who's angry and resentful and hostile because he proceeds from the assumption immediately that he's not going to get what he needs, and maybe he tries to do it forcefully, or maybe he tries to do it through control or other ways. But in my view, at the bottom of it, at the root of it, a lot of the time we're talking about the same thing, which is a boy who grew up feeling like his primary role was to keep his mother pleased and not make her angry, and be complimented and seen as her source of pleasure and her source of affirmation, mm-hmm. and so forth. And that can result in an adult male that is on one end of the spectrum or the other, as I just said.
Mm-hmm. We have had conversations like these before. It is, I think, a critical area to look at, and that is, you have pointed to the fact that in addition to that relationship with his woman, with his wife, with his partner, that the dynamics associated with this are actually, and I'm quoting you, then the consequences, you say, they extend deep into the core of a man, and here are the words you use: rippling outward into all areas of his life and diminishing his ability to own and express his sexual energy and power in the healthy, creative ways needed to develop and maintain successful, long-term love relationships and a working life that is authentic, heartfelt, and meaningful. That sounds... critical is not the word. Crucial is not the word. This to me sounds as if this is not healed, and if this impacts a man at this level, then we are looking at some pretty dysfunctional relationships. Yes, and some pretty unhappy men, and frequently they don't know why, and it's a lot of lost potential too. And I can tell you, from my own experience that. I did not know that I was not a separate person from my mother until a few years ago. I didn't know that I didn't know that, but once I had that realization and once I had that breakthrough,
not only was I able to take more ownership of myself and my own life and my own decisions and the consequences of the actions that I take, but I was also able to see her more fully as a separate person who had her own life. And I was able to release her of a lot of the expectations that I had that she was never going to be able to meet, because I hadn't been able to. She didn't see me as a separate person, and I didn't see her as a separate person either. And if you're not able to do that in any relationship, then ultimately that's going to be destructive, and it's going to hold both people back from being fully who they are.
Many mothers have that kind of relationship with their sons. From your own research, is this more prolific than we think?
I think it is. I think it is. I think it's more common, and I think it's more serious in terms of its effects than we realize. And one of the reasons that I feel confident saying that is that people are afraid to talk about it. It's very taboo. At least, I'm in the United States, and I know here in the United States, it's not considered to be taboo to talk about problems with your father, whether you're a son or a daughter. I think there's some openness to daughters talking about problems in their relationships with their mothers. I would say of all of those, the one that you hear the least about and the one that makes people bristle and uncomfortable the most is a son talking about a dysfunctional or problematic relationship with his mother. And to me, that's a red flag. If you can't talk about it, then I suspect that there's something going on. And I suspect from my own experience and the experience that I've seen and shared with men and men's groups over the last 3 decades, that there is a lot more of this under the surface than anybody's willing to talk about at this point. And I do think, as you said before, that it's actually pretty destructive, and it comes out in other ways that aren't necessarily associated with it.
And in your own personal experience, you recognized this, you acknowledged it, and were you able to resolve it? Are you still resolving it?
It's a work in progress. I don't know that it's the sorts of wounds that we receive as children, which everybody does, because it's just impossible for any parents or any family system to completely meet a child's needs. But in cases where there's been some deeper wounding and some healing work is needed, I think the best that you can hope for, at least in my case, is to kind of keep pointing yourself toward that little point on the horizon and get as close as you can. I would say that I have made a tremendous amount of progress in the last 4 to 5 years in resolving a great deal of my mother wound, and it has made a tremendous difference in my life, but there's always a little bit more to do, because there's always something there that I didn't get, and so the work for me is to try to recognize that and give it to myself in other ways as much as I can, and that tends to, in my experience, decrease the size and the severity and the effect of the original situation that caused the wound in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're right about the subject being taboo, the mother-son relationship, especially within the context of a mother wound. I'm getting a plethora of responses on the social media right now, and even before, when we actually put this out and we were running the promo, people are uncomfortable with it and would rather we not talk about it or to include many other issues. Why do you think that this is so? Especially, we're getting this especially from mothers and especially from sons.
Well, it's a little hard to say. I mean, I know that, again, in the culture that I grew up in, that I'm here in the United States, there is just sort of there's a very broad, very deep cultural assumption and sort of an understanding or an agreement between mothers and sons that the mother is to be protected at all costs. I think there are some very good functional reasons for that, but I think, as with anything, if it's taken to a complete extreme, then it becomes dysfunctional and it becomes unhealthy. And for whatever reason, this is the state of things, and I don't know. I think some of it just has to, to do with the whole sort of masculine tendency to protect the feminine, which again I think is a good thing. But at the same time, if it swings too far to the side where, I don't think it's healthy in any case with anything if you can't look at it critically and if you can't look at the downside of it. And this certainly would fall into that category for me, because without balance, you don't have something that's healthy and you don't have something that's functional that actually works for everybody.
We have a question online from Jay, and he's asking whether to explain further what you mean by being unable to separate yourselves. Mother unable to separate herself from son, son unable to separate himself from mother.
Okay. Well, I can say that in my case, I've physically moved 2,000 miles when I was 19 years old. And I had the idea that if I separated physically, that would separate me from the entire family, and that I would be independent of that whole situation. And I think to kind of put it in practical terms, I guess, I think one of the key indicators of whether an adult man has fully separated from his mother in a functional way is whether or not he can actually say no to her. When she makes a request for his time or for his attention or for something else, I would say, in my experience, if a man cannot say no and perhaps offer an alternative, but at least have the ability to say, no, I'm not going to do that. I can't do that right now. I've got to do something else. If you can never say no to your mother, if you're sitting there on the phone and she's talking and you just feel miserable and you don't want to hear it and you feel trapped, that to me is an indication that you have not separated yet. If you feel like you can never let her know that you're unhappy with a situation in the relationship or something that she's done or something that she said, that to me would be another situation that indicates that you've not separated. It's often mistaken, I think, as being respectful. And being respectful is a good thing. And that's, to me, is a different sort of thing. Being respectful means that you understand that you have a choice. And you're going to consciously behave in a certain way, as opposed to respectful to me is not, I have no choice. I just have to take it. I just have to do it. I can't say that I don't want to or I'm not going to.
Mm-hmm. On the as we look at this spectrum, and I'm listening to you closely because I'm wondering how close a man like that, a boy who has become a man, could develop into a narcissistic personality.
I think that is one of the possibilities. I think one of the possibilities is that he also could become very narcissistic. And on the other end of the spectrum, he could become codependent, which is kind of the flip side of it. And the codependent side is what I was just speaking about. But I certainly think that the narcissistic side could also be a result as well. That could be, depending upon the personality and the circumstances and so forth, you could become someone who's very focused on meeting other people's needs, or you could become someone who's very focused on getting your own needs met no matter what.
And we're speaking about the mother wound in men. Rick Belden is my very special guest this morning as we welcome you to the space. Rick, so many persons writing in, and I want to get some of those questions in. We only have 10 minutes. But let me just ask, because Devon is asking about the relationship between the mother and the father and how that impacts the mother wound.
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, it can vary a lot situationally. I can share in my own experience, in my own case. It's interesting, and it's an interesting question. It has a lot of different aspects. So, first of all, I'll say this. In my own personal journey, my initial work was all about the father wound. And that's where a lot of men start. And in a lot of ways, that's an easier place to start because, as I said earlier, there seems to be more acceptance and permission to say, hey, my father was a problem in my childhood, and I'm still being affected by it. And that's what I've seen almost always. That's what men go into first. And in my own situation, I grew up feeling much closer to my mother because my father was distant. He was unapproachable. He was angry. He was emotionally unavailable. He worked a lot. And so my mother was around more, and he did not treat her well. And it was very consistent, and it was very obvious. And so that amplified my desire to feel like I was her ally, to protect her, to look out for her. And in retrospect, I can see that she used that to her advantage, so that she didn't feel so alone in a marriage with someone who was hostile. And so I think there can absolutely be a lot of interplay between those two things, because as a child, if you're paying attention, you see the dynamic between your parents. And if you see a difficult dynamic between, like the one I described, where the father is angry and hostile, the mother feels like your protector, then I think as a child you're naturally going to gravitate to her, and as a boy you're going to want to protect her, and that's going to carry over into your adulthood. And I guess from my standpoint, one of the measures would be that if your desire to protect your mother and your desire to respect your mother is so strong and so predominant that it has a negative effect on the rest of your life and your relationships, then I would suggest that you have a mother wound that is worth looking at.
Wow. I'm pausing here, Rick. Let me just tell you what's happening. The social media is a buzz. Lots of responses. And a good 50% of them are from men. And they're not happy with the conversation we're having in terms of how we might be portraying mother. If you were to speak to these men, what would you say?
Well, the first thing I would say is that I don't have any desire or any intention to project anything negative about women or mothers at all. My desire here is to give men the opportunity to look at their relationships with their mothers and maybe step back from them a little bit and try to be a little bit more objective about the effect that relationship may have in their lives. Now, for many men, this may not be an issue at all. Their mothers may have been emotionally healthy themselves, and they created a great environment for the boy as a child through his teen years. They understand that he needs to go through a certain kind of psychological separation from them to become independent and become an adult. And in those cases, there's really nothing to look at. Mm-hmm. The cases that I'm looking at are cases like my own case and other cases with men that I've seen where those conditions that I just talked about were not present, or they were not fully present. And as you alluded to earlier when you quoted some of my work, that it impedes the man from having full access to himself as a man, to his masculinity, and to allow him to actually be fully who he is in the world, and to have full, satisfying, functional, healthy relationships with other women, whoever they are in his life. Mm-hmm. So if you don't fall into that category where there's anything problematic going on in your life, then I'm really not speaking to you. But if you fall into on the other side, where you can see some dysfunction in your life, particularly it will manifest in your relationships with women, but also potentially in your relationship with yourself, as I said, around your work, around your sense of your own authority and sovereignty and all those sorts of things, then I think it's worth looking at.
Mm-hmm. Time is a factor, so I want to get you, how do you begin to heal the mother wound? Let us take the few minutes that we have to talk about that, Rick.
There are several entry points to that, and I think the most available one is just to begin to pay attention to how you feel during your interactions with her, if she's still in your life, or how you feel in your memory of your interaction with her if she's no longer in your life. And so one of the things that I noticed was, after I'd had a phone call with my mom the next day, I would be in a terrible mood every time. And I started to look at that and go, why might that be the case? One of the things that you can do that's real easy as a first step is to just sit down and write a letter to your mom that not to send, just for yourself, and just really be as completely honest as you can about how you feel about the relationship and what you remember, and how you think it might have affected your life. But most of all, I think the most important thing as a baseline is to really look at how you treat yourself, moment to moment, day to day. Do you take good care of yourself? How do you talk to yourself? Because much of the inner talk and the self-talk that we learned, that we picked up as children, does come from our mothers. If you feel that you're very self-critical, if you feel that you're unable to, like, as I said before, articulate your needs, learning how to understand what your needs are, all those things are kind of practical things that you can do that don't even involve, any kind of conversation with your mom or anything like that. Just being more attentive to yourself, how you feel moment to moment, and again, particularly how you feel after you've interacted with her or during an interaction. Are you really being yourself, I guess is what it comes down to. Can you do that?
Wow. Thank you so much, Rick. I'm going to give you a final word. I'm going to give you a final word because I've been looking at your work. I know the work you have done. I know that you're speaking from your own personal experience. And with just 5 minutes to go before the end of the program, speak directly to the man who, after hearing this, once recognizes himself in a lot of what you've said and wants to make the next step.
Yes, what I would say to those men is, first of all, that it's okay for you to give yourself permission to look at your relationship with your mother as a child, as an adult. It's okay for you to look at your feelings about that and to be honest with yourself about it. And it doesn't all have to be perfect. It doesn't all have to be the way that the people around you or the culture around you says it's supposed to look. And it's okay to, I think, forgive yourself for having some feelings that maybe you don't want to have. And it's really, again, for me, what I learned in this, two things. One was this is really about developing a better relationship with yourself, because the better your relationship with yourself is, the better your relationship's going to be with everybody else.
Quickly before,
and it's also, yeah.
Quickly, Rick, before we wrap, an interesting question coming in from Aldis Hunker is listening in the Netherlands, and she says, my problem with this is that if you have the ability to self-diagnose so perfectly, shouldn't you be past the point of whining about that aspect of your life?
I don't think we really get past things. I think we work through things. And I think if you find somebody that you see and you feel like they're whining, they might be whining, but it might be because they don't know they can do anything else about it. And there's actually something there. It's not a wimpy thing to do, to actually go into this work and really go into the heart of it, because it's difficult and there's going to be some grieving involved and there's a lot of shame around it. But honestly, in my experience, it's actually one of the best things you can do for your mom, because if you're not able to see your mom as a real person, then you're not doing her any favors, and you're actually not being the best you can be to her. And I think that's what I think all men and all sons, at the bottom of it, want to be the best that they can be to their mom, whether it's she's still physically with them or whether it's in memory or whatever. And so there's nothing whiny about this if you're actually doing the work. It's actually really courageous, deep work. That
I think she was speaking specifically to being able to self-diagnose. Is that how do you self-diagnose? Is this something that takes that has to be looked at another level, or can you figure this out just by sitting down, thinking about how you're feeling, the relationship you're having with your mother, how that makes you feel, and so on? Are you able to if you get to that point where you can self-diagnose, would you have been along the healing trajectory, I think is what she's saying?
Oh, I think that. Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's a great question. In my case, I was able to get with some really good counselors over the years and be in some really good men's groups. So, yes, I had a lot of external help to help me get a perspective on this. And I started with a counselor 5 or 6 years ago who was the first one who said I was working on dreams that I had, and she would consistently say, well, look at how your mother appears in this dream. How do you feel about that? How does she seem to be to you? Is this consistent with who you think she is? So that's kind of a long answer to a short question, I guess, which is that I think that you can do a lot on your own, but I also think that you're probably going to need some help from somebody who can actually step back and isn't attached to the situation and kind of reflect some of those behaviors and perceptions and beliefs back to you.
Mm-hmm. Rick Belden, thank you so much. So much to talk about, but I hope that our listeners will continue the research, will continue the conversation in the social spaces, the social media spaces, in your homes, wherever you are. Have the conversation and let us see if we can begin to heal the nation, as my friend Denise Isis Miller is saying to us online, that we need to get to this point if we're talking about nation healing. And I think this is where we are as a nation, Jamaica. Thank you so much, Rick.
You're welcome. It's a difficult topic, and thanks for having me.
All right. It really is a difficult topic. Really. No lie.